already? Okay, thank you very much. Welcome to this meeting of the Children's Services Overview and Scrutiny Committee. Go straight into apologies, I think.
Councillor Hellier-Simons is going to be a little bit late, and Sal Thurway sent his apologies.
I think everyone knows each other this time. We introduced ourselves last time. I think everyone's familiar with me. A bit more. Okay, let's try and see if we can do that. Yeah. That any better? Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. Maybe just quickly introduce ourselves again, actually, just to be sure. So I'm Norman Jorgensen, member for Maiden Early Ward. Rebecca, if you'd like to just introduce yourself, please.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Rebecca Margetts from Finchampstead South.
Hello, Jackie Rance from Shinfield South. Hello, I'm Prue Bray from Winnersh.
Andrew Mickleborough, Hawkland Ward in Early.
Maureen Morvan from Embrook.
Luciani Barker from Democratic Services.
And those that are online, Carol and Graham, please just let us know who's there. Thank you.
Carol Camis, Director of Children's Services, Working Borough Council.
Graham Howe, Executive Lead Member for Children's Services, Wokingham Council.
Got Piers and Gillian on the line as well.
Yeah, Gillian Cole, Children's Services Service Manager for Schools.
Yeah. And Piers Browning from the Strategy and Commissioning team to talk later about school place sufficiency.
Right, thanks very much. Okay, so we'll move to item 14, which is the minutes of the previous meeting. Anyone got any comments or amendments to those minutes? Andrew?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I believe that the minutes are an accurate and true record of what was discussed, and I also understand that the UNICEF application has been successful, and if so, this is very good news indeed, and thanks to everybody involved. Thanks also to Sal for circulating the data on permanent exclusions. I didn't see anything there that I would wish to raise tonight, but wonder if updates could be circulated regularly. Going back to the minutes, further in the minutes, it was stated that nationally there were growing concerns about the impact of the pandemic on non-mobile under 2-year-old children. Could we have an update on this, and particularly any concerns in our borough and any additional actions that are being taken to address this? And then I also have one other request, if that's okay. Adam agreed to look into providing data on how long some care leavers were NEET. Now, I recognise that there are many different reasons for being NEET and that such data would have to be interpreted with great care. But I'm just wondering whether there's been any progress made on providing that, producing that data. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is Carol or any of the team able to comment on those?
Yes. So in terms of the under 2s issue, that was pre-mobile babies and some significant harm to pre-mobile babies during the first lockdown. So we haven't seen that as an ongoing theme post or during the kind of periods of COVID as we've gone on during the pandemic. But what we have done is we have a specialist worker in our front door who is specifically looking and working with looking at the data, looking at the children coming through the system 0 to 5, so that we can be on the making sure that we've been proactive in relation to working with those families who may be struggling with some of the impact of COVID and having very young babies. and in relation to the care leaver data, I gave Adam permission not to attend today because the items are all on education, but I will pick up with him, Andrew, and make sure that he gets those that detail to you.
Thank you.
Oh, and the other thing, sorry, just to confirm, Norman, yes, we have been successful. I was going to raise that this evening. We have been successful in our application to become a child-friendly community under the auspices of UNICEF as an organisation. That's fantastic news, and that programme will officially start in January of next year.
Yeah, good news. Thank you. Yeah. Right. Any other comments on the minutes? Evening, Pauline. Just note you've arrived. Okay. So if there are no comments, can I just put those formally to the vote that we accept them as a true record of the meeting? Those in favour, please. Okay, that's unanimous. Thank you very much. So I'll sign those. Good. Good. So the next item is 15 declarations of interest. Any declarations of interest? There are none. Oh, approved.
I will, because I'm going to raise it later, which is the same one I made last time, which is on the Governor at the Forest. I want to say something about Forest in the education update.
Thank you. Item 16, public question time. No questions and member questions. No member questions. So we'll move straight on to item 18, which is the education update. We had the supplementary report, which hopefully everybody's received. Emailed to us and a copy to you tonight as well. So just wonder, I think it's Gillian, is it, that's going to introduce
Yes.
this one?
Yep.
Carol?
Yes, it is Gillian. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Gillian.
Yeah, I'm hoping my Teams is really slow this evening, so hopefully, colleagues, you can hear me now. So thank you. Yes, a brief update this evening in relation to what's happening with schools. Hopefully you've been able to see in the report the kind of journey of the schools over the pandemic period. During the summer term of 21, we continue to operate within the DfE guidance with a significant number of mitigations still in place for schools around particular operational restrictions, those being in respect of bubbles, so restricted groupings to enable schools to undertake the contact tracing work when positive cases appeared. The twice weekly lateral flow testing programme for our secondary age pupils, which we had a really positive uptake from the community for, and all of our staff in schools, whether primary or secondary schools, were also undertaking that twice weekly lateral flow testing. They continued the enhanced cleaning and hygiene factors, staggered starts and ends to the day, in order to minimise pupil and parent contact or unnecessary gatherings. And that necessitated some revised travel arrangements. And of course, we had the continuation of the restriction to off-site visits that then was gradually relaxed as the summer term wore on, and we saw the ability for schools to be able to move to some local trips and visits towards the latter end of the summer term. We have additional duties that still exist for schools in respect of remote learning. So there is still a remote learning directive in place, and schools must have available on their website information about how parents may access remote learning for any child who is away from school but remains well for a reason related to the pandemic, in order for them to have continuous access to schooling and education. From September the 1st, we have a complete change in restrictions, which are in line with the roadmap nationally that central government is looking at. So all of those things that I've just outlined, a number of those now no longer required by the guidance. However, that doesn't prevent schools from having undertaken their own risk assessments in their own specific context and looked at what in particular would be positive things for them to be able to continue with going forward. So we have schools who have actually found that reducing mixing at the beginning of the day or at the end of the day, so having a staggered start, has been really helpful in terms of minimising traffic impact around their school sites. And so they've kept that as a benefit to the wider community, so have really reduced some traffic pinch points around their sites by continuing with a staggered start. So we've encouraged schools to look really positively at what they've been doing, that they've been able to keep as part of their
the minimum revenue
operational
extends to investment
methodology in moving forward this term. The lateral flow testing programme continues this month for our secondary age pupils, and we've seen schools implement that at the beginning of this term. They were enabled to do that a few days before term started and during the early days of this autumn term, in order to do 2 on-site tests and then a further test for children before they re-entered into that twice weekly testing at home.
Councillor G.
That has surfaced a number of cases in order to protect the community. Those children who've tested positive on the lateral flow test are then asked to undertake a PCR test to confirm that they're positive, and then they engage if they are well in remote education, and if not, they take sickness leave. So that's what we have happening in terms of support in school for them to be able to continue operating in a COVID secure way. So we've moved away from a bubble operation. We've moved away from some of those more restrictive mitigations in place, but we are still expecting schools to work on their hygiene, on their frequent cleaning processes, and their strong infection control procedures in order to minimise any infection transmission. Our school leaders are continuing to attend the weekly leadership drop-in, and in the last fortnight we've been exploring best practice around infection control and how colleagues can seek assurance from our health professionals. So Ingrid Slade, who is our public health consultant, has also attended those drop-ins to give first-hand advice and guidance from a public health perspective to our school leaders. These events are really popular with our head teachers, and we get a really high attendance here. So we get 45 attendees on a weekly basis attending those sessions. If we look at school performance indicators, colleagues may recall that at the start of last academic year, we were anticipating there being a full suite of national performance indicators and the usual statutory testing cycle continuing during 2021. However, this, as you may be aware, was eventually halted and switched to teacher assessed grades at GCSE and A level, and that the process of awarding those teacher assessed grades, or tags as they've been known, was a complex operation for schools during the summer term period, and a significant increase in workload for those practitioners, which I have to say, colleagues, our staff in schools went about with absolute professionalism. And that this was a different process to that which was undertaken during the assessment process during 2020. So we've had 2 years of completely different assessment processes for our GCSE and A-level students. And we had the removal again in 2021 of all statutory testing processes in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. DFE has confirmed that as a result of that, all performance tables remain suspended. So we have no comparative data, no local data or no national data with which to be able to do any analysis of performance at a local level. There will be no analysed school performance reports issued by the DFE, and we'll have no local statistics. So that will be the second year running for that, colleagues. In terms of Ofsted, we've had Ofsted doing some remote visits during the spring and summer term during 2021. And we had a number of schools, as I've outlined in the report, who were visited, those virtual reports. And at those points for those monitoring visits, the judgment process was really just to ascertain as to whether or not schools were continuing to provide an effective education for pupils given the current context. And the focus of those visits was on the fact that remote education and reflecting provision nationally at that particular time in pandemic delivery. We did have 2 schools in the borough who experienced those virtual visits during the spring term, which was Gorse Ryde Junior and the Forest School, who were judged to be providing effective education in line with that analysis. Substantive inspection schedule was paused until September 2021. However, Section 8 monitoring visits did continue during the summer term. They had no power to change a grading, but inspectors could call forward a Section 5 if they felt that the school's current grading was no longer an accurate reflection of where the school is at the point of the Section 8 visit. And we know that this happened for the Forest School, and at the time of writing, their subsequent Section 5 report had not yet been published, which is why I've not been able to attach it to this report for you. So it will follow as soon as it's in the public domain, and we have it to publish to you in the next round of meetings. From the start of this term, with effect from last week, the full inspection programme returned, and we already know that Ofsted are out on the patch and undertaking inspections, so I will be reporting on outcomes of those as we move forward through the calendar year and giving you the details on what's happened with those reports. Just to be aware, colleagues, that the current inspection schedule is behind, and that is due to the pandemic disruption. And we are informed by Her Majesty's Chief Inspector that we can expect a delay to the inspection schedule of up to 6 terms. So that's approaching the 2-year mark, and that the statutory guidance issued from this September has been updated to reflect that. So we're actually working this year with priority on schools who are in an inspection window. So the team are prioritising their work with those schools. And that is the group of schools that we are working with in the first instance this half term. And then I've just outlined for you in the report the other key priority work streams that we have, which relate to racial equity in schools, the therapeutic thinking approach, and the wellbeing and mental health strands, which all continue with full programmes of development training and resources available to the whole school community over this academic year. So, Chair, I hope that's a helpful walkthrough of an education update for colleagues.
Great, thank you very much for that. Questions? Prue?
Thank you, Chairman. And Gillian's absolutely right that at the time she wrote this report, the Forest Ofsted report had not been published, but it has actually now been published. And it's available on the school website. And I can tell you that it is an across the board good, which is a huge relief to all the governors. We all cheered when they gave us the results at the feedback meeting. That was why they brought the Section 8 forward, because when they came, sorry, the Section 5 forward, because when they came from the Section 8, they could see. I think it was the same inspector that came and did the effectiveness one.
It was
remote learning, yeah. Yes. And she picked up from that really we needed to be looked at because we were no longer clearly requires improvement.
Yeah,
and that has been vindicated. Yep.
Yeah, it is a really good outcome from the school, and our congratulations have already been passed on to the school, but worth noting here. Thank you.
Yes, we appreciated the assistance that was given to the school and the support from the council, and the head deserves a huge amount of credit for the last 4 years' work, which really has, as I say, we're good across the board is really very pleasing to see.
Great, good news, yeah. Andrew?
Yes, thank you. I've got 3 or 4 questions, if I may, and I'd like to ask them one at a time. But before I do that, I'd just like to begin by echoing Gillian's comments regarding the very positive impact that the staggered start and finish times for schools are having on traffic and congestion. I'm really pleased, that many schools are continuing with this. The first area that I'd like to ask a question about is not actually raised in your report, but I understand that in some parts of the borough, areas outside schools and on routes to school are being targeted with a lot of anti-vaccination fly posting. Have any schools raised concerns with WBC about this? And is WBC taking any action to try to tackle this? And I understand that the messages are targeted in some cases very specifically at the children themselves as well as at parents.
Thank you. It's not something that's been brought to our attention by schools themselves or by the wider community. So that's really helpful intelligence to have. And that's something that certainly in the Children's COVID Task Force I can take away and have a look at and see how we might support that with some more positive messages. I know we've been working with our colleagues in the PR and comms team on some really positive messaging around vaccination and reaching out through social media to our young people. But that's something I can definitely pick up tomorrow with our colleagues in the comms team. So thank you for letting me know that.
No, thank you, Gillian. The second area, you mentioned the requirement continues to provide remote learning opportunities for children unable to attend school because of COVID. Are there any signs that providing this, in addition to near full classes for face-to-face teaching, is causing concerns amongst any teaching staff? It must be very demanding, running effectively 2 systems in some schools in parallel. And are there any children who've been receiving remote learning for lengthy periods of time and who are likely to continue to do so? And if so, are there any concerns about them falling behind their peers?
Okay, thank you for that. I think it's really important that we do recognise the workload that the remote education provision places on our colleagues in schools. They've had some time now to work in finding a system that works effectively for them. And what they've been doing is a number of schools have got provision on their websites that parents are able to access, or have packs that children are able to access from school or get delivered home. What we find happening is now that staff are thinking more proactively when they are planning their lessons, of thinking as to what that similar lesson might look like if it had to be, the materials from it had to be sent home or be accessed remotely. So actually that at the point of planning, we've been encouraging practitioners to think very proactively and think about how that might streamline some of their work. The other thing that we've noticed happening is where staff may be unable to undertake their normal duties in school, they've been supporting through remote education. So particularly last term, if we had any of our clinically extremely vulnerable members of staff who weren't able for specific reasons to undertake face-to-face teaching, they were able to support the remote learning offer at home. And in terms of your question, there was 3 elements to your question. The second one was about had we noticed children having difficulty accessing it. I think we're very early into the autumn term at the moment, so children having difficulty or accessing it for an extended period of time, it would be difficult to say based from this September. And the requirements are slightly different this September. So we have the return to the requirement for children to be attending school. So attendance is once again compulsory. So we're really looking at children who are awaiting a positive COVID test or have symptoms themselves, but may be well enough to work. And maybe well enough to access that remote education. So at the moment, we have experienced very few children who've needed to access for any significant period of time remote education, but it is one of the things that our task force is monitoring and looking at how often and how many children are missing school at any one point. So that is definitely something that we're looking at. And I'm really sorry, but I didn't make a note of the third area on the remote education that you were interested in, Andrew.
Well, that was whether there were any concerns about children who may have been engaging in remote learning over a significant period of time, falling behind their peers. But I think you've kind of, I think you have answered that.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay. If I can continue, are you able to provide any data on the number of schools in the borough that offered any form of catch-up activities over the summer, including for children making the transition from years 6 to 7? And are you aware of any plans to continue this, possibly in future, during future half terms and other breaks?
So I don't have the data to hand in terms of how many schools actually provided the summer school programme, but I do know that we had a significant uptake across the borough, particularly for the schools eligible for the summer school programme funded by the Department for Education. I'd say that was significant, but I can certainly furnish you with the details post the meeting as to how many took up that offer, and that was particularly around the year 6 to year 7 transfer area, and there were summer schools on offer at our secondary, in a number of our secondary provision over the summer holiday period. So and that's something I can provide you with post meeting.
Okay, that's excellent, thank you. And finally, you mentioned that one of the ongoing work streams is with respect to racial equity. I'm just wondering whether you could provide a brief summary of some of the work that is progressing.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be delighted to, actually, because this is a really big piece of work for us at the moment. So we have planned a whole year's worth of work. We've been working with a Black and minority ethnic stakeholder group from across the education sector locally, and they've been influencing and being a sounding board for how we've constructed the work. And we commissioned the Reading International Solidarity Centre, who have huge expertise in this field of work, to do some facilitation for that group for us and for officers in order to help us come up with a comprehensive strategy in order to be able to support the schools community in taking this work forward. That work took place during the spring and summer terms. And so as a result of that, we've just published our offer and joint working for schools in the last fortnight. So if I just run through some of the things that are in that, we are starting this term with a workshop for school leaders to come along to, along with we're encouraging them to bring a person of colour or an ethnic minority employee from their school community so that they become part of this work and influence the work as well. And this workshop is looking at how we help schools plan their racial equity work in their own context. So we've got a series of questions and things to work them through in these workshops. And what we'll be doing is then enabling them to think about the offer that we have, and I'll outline the offer in a moment, is to think from that offer, which are the pieces of that offer that make the most sense for them to be able to work with first, or what order that they would like to do things in and how they would like to work with the particular elements of the offer. So those planning for racial equity work in your school workshops, which are led by my colleagues Majid Ali and Emily Waddilove, they are happening in the next month. We also have the stakeholder group who are working with colleagues in the community engagement team. So Emily and Majid have approached a stakeholder group. A stakeholder group have elected a smaller group to come and work with the community engagement team on a borough-wide approach to the Black History Month, which is coming up later this autumn. So there will be some focused work around Black History Month that our residents and stakeholders from in schools will be influencing and working with our colleagues in community engagement on. And then if we think about what is happening in terms of the offer to schools, we have some training around developing an understanding of unconscious bias. This will be for staff who would like to facilitate a reading and discussion group for their colleagues and to be able to work supportively with them. And that work will be led by a member of the BAME Ed network, which is a national group, but we're delighted that actually we're going to be continuing to work with Amjad Ali, who has actually been a teacher in one of our schools and lives in the borough, and his children attend our schools, but he actually works for the BAME Ed organisation. So he's going to be supporting that work. We will also then have some sessions led by Race Matters on racial literacy, which will be training for school staff and governors to think about reflections and next steps. Then we will have some work particularly targeted at primary schools, which the first element of would be conducting an audit of resources, thinking about how you evaluate the resources that you have in school, and thinking about those from a representational angle, and thinking about how they might be disproportionate or how they might be changed to be more reflective of an equitable approach. The second element then would be about teaching pre-colonial Africa, and this will be linked with RISC's Global Histories project, and that's 4 2-hour modules that will happen between October and January, and that will be actually run by RISC. And then we have some training around bringing BAME adults into your school and looking at guidance and a compilation of resources and organisations and potentially a mentoring programme. In terms of secondary school priorities, we have 2 specific offers. Firstly, around creating safe spaces for BAME pupils, which will be facilitating workshops for people of colour and enabling staff to be trained in being able to facilitate those sessions. And then also a second approach, which will be about how you review your approach to incidents and issues, which we're calling Staff Allies training. And those 2 sessions will be led by Race Allies. The other element that we're also picking up on is we're working in conjunction with Reading University, looking at a potential mentoring scheme by students of colour from the university, mentoring and working with some of our students of colour in our secondary schools with some positive journey stories and aspirational messages and you know, a structured mentoring process. So that element is very embryonic at the moment, and we're just at the discussion stage with colleagues at Reading University who are setting that up as part of what I believe is a national programme. So I hope, Andrew, that begins to flesh a bit of that work out for you.
Yeah, it certainly does, and thank you very much indeed, Gillian, and to everybody who's been involved in this work. There's been a huge amount of work and progress made in this important area since we last met, and the offer that you have described, you know, seems to be really well thought through. It's structured, and a number of innovative, I think quite innovative ideas within there. And I think it's also really, really good that you are and your team are drawing very widely, you know, on local and expertise from further afield. So I'm really, really pleased with this report. Thank you.
Thank you. It has been a lot of work for the team, and they're very mindful of the fact that this work has to be very sensitively approached. So I will pass on your thanks to them. Much appreciated.
Thanks very much. Any further questions on this report? Oh.
Hello. I think it's with me, but I think it's on page 5, taking a supplement, of course, at the bottom. It says officers will be, it says something like officers will be challenging schools, and I just wondered what that meant.
So thank you. One of our statutory functions is to support and challenge schools. So where I set out and said that we would be working as a first priority this half of term in engaging with our schools who are in the inspection window, it will be a desktop conversation with them around their outcomes, where they are and what their priorities are. It will be a supportive conversation, but clearly there will be a challenge to it in terms of challenging how ready they are to demonstrate that they are able to sustain their good or better outcome in a potential Ofsted inspection. So it's in that conversation around some of the very more technical elements of education where we provide that challenge to schools. I kind of describe it at times as holding up the mirror and saying, is this the picture you really want to see? Because this is the picture we see. And if it's not, how can we help you to change that?
All right, thanks very much. Yes, that sounds helpful. Thank you.
Okay, Ruth.
Thank you. I've got two completely separate things. If I don't mind, I'll do them one at a time. I'm not necessarily asking for an answer tonight about this, but I'll explain what the question is and then you can see whether you can answer it. So it has been suggested to me by somebody else, and I don't know the answer, which is why I'm asking the question, that there have been pressure on primary school places in Arborfield caused by the closure of Farley Hill, and that the transfer of the pupils from Farley Hill to the new school in the SDL has meant there are not enough places in that school for the children in the SDL, and they've had to go elsewhere. And I'm wondering whether, first of all, whether that's the case, and secondly, if it is the case, could you perhaps after the meeting quantify it for us to show us what has actually happened and where those students have had to go? Okay, so if I'll start an answer, and I think Piers may be best placed to give you the technical answer. So I think from a school improvement perspective, Farley Hill has been lifted and shifted to its new location. So its admission number, its area from which it draws its children, and the children and numbers of children who are able to access it has not changed. So Piers, I don't know if you want to comment more technically on top of that answer. Sorry, I think you're muted, Piers.
We can't hear you at the moment.
You can't hear me. Rectify. Yes, as a local authority, of course, our responsibility is to education across the borough. So we have to look at the sufficiency of places, and creating additional capacity at that school in the context of the capacity that we have in that area couldn't be justified at that point. You must remember that the Garrison community, which is now part of the Arborfield Green community, has traditionally always been served by two schools, the Coombs School and Farley Hill School. And the Coombs School certainly, has had capacity historically to take many children. The reality is that 30 places at Farley Hill School isn't sufficient to meet the needs of the Arborfield Green community in its entirety. But the residents in the community do have access to other schools, and the majority of them have secure places at other preferred schools. So they are within walking distance of the Coombs School. Many of them are within walking on distance of Gorsride Infant School, where the council has laid in two walking routes to there through the new Greenway route, which is street lit, and indeed another walking route that goes along 9 Mile Ride. And there are a number of other schools that residents have expressed preferences for and had their children successfully admitted to. So yes, it is absolutely the case that a number of residents in the Arborfield community, Arborfield Green community, did feel aggrieved that they were unable to get their children into the relocated Farley Hill Primary. But the challenge is that there isn't sufficient capacity, or that there would be an even greater oversupply of school places had we expanded that school to 2 forms of entry at that point.
I think I thought that would probably be the answer. I mean, I can't see loads of children having to travel miles and miles and miles. But thank you. The other one is completely disconnected, and I'm going to ask it very carefully. But I think I do need to ask it because it's been on the news today. So this is a parent whose child has failed to get a place at West End, and it's on the BBC News, on BBC South today. So I'm not going to ask you about the details of that case, because I think that you wouldn't be able to tell me, and I don't think I should be asking in a public forum. But what I would like to know is what the role of the council is in a case where a child doesn't get a place that perhaps the parents been expecting when that child has got an EHCP and the school they were expecting to go to is an academy. What exactly is the role of the council in dealing with that?
I think that's probably better if you could put that in writing, Prue, and we can respond in writing. Because
that's fine. Yes.
Thank you.
No, it's okay. I understand the sensitivities around it. But if I put it in writing, maybe the answer could be circulated to all the committee members so that we all know. So it's a case of me understanding the process, because obviously it's not our school necessarily, and control that we might have is quite limited.
That's fine.
Okay, we're just going to do a bit of a technical fix, because in the room here we can't see Piers and Gillian, whereas on the streaming on the PCs we can see them. So I'm just going to try and fix that. So just bear with. Okay, I think we're fixed, hopefully. So we can carry on. Any further questions on this report? If not, thanks very much, Gillian. That was very comprehensive. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll move on to item 19, which is the secondary school sufficiency. And I believe that Piers is going to introduce this one.
I am indeed, Chair. I'm going to try and give you a fairly brief summary of what's in the papers in front of you and try and update it as far as I can for the position today. And if I may, I'll add a very brief commentary on post 16 and the position for SEN, but that's really only really with a focus on the secondary sector. But I think the critical piece of information really is in terms of supply of places. This year we secured sufficient places for all on-time applicants, but we did that with the assistance of 2 schools on offer day by making additional offers to the Embrook School and Wangels College with the agreement of their head teachers. Since that point, the total number of applications has dropped, as it does every year, effectively, and now the total number of applicants is slightly less, total number of allocations, shall I say, is slightly less than the number of places available in the borough. The complication in the borough, and it's just to reflect on the good news from Forest, is that at the moment the Forest School hasn't been the most popular, most preferred school in the borough. The consequence of that has been that we have had a very significant number of places available for boys only at the Forest, whereas we haven't had capacity for girls. The difficulty has been that where we've agreed additional capacity, it's been at co-educational schools. They've all had waiting lists, and of course the waiting lists include boys and girls, and directly or indirectly the consequence of that has been that we've increased the number of surplus places at the Forest School. So by ensuring that we've got sufficient places for girls, we've only been able, the result has been that we have increased the problems for the Forest School. But that's an intersection of admissions law, a process which is a national process effectively around the managing the admissions into schools at the first point of admission, and parental preference, unfortunately, at the moment. And I think we will hope that now that the Forest has its good news, that parents will see that as a much more viable choice, and then we'll see a much more significant number of higher preferences for that school in future. But that's the position, for this year as we stand. Since the allocation day, there were a number of other factors that came into play, and in particular, there was a considerable level of concern expressed by the community in South Twyford that they were unable to get their children into Pigott, and particularly that schools where the whole cohort had attended one primary school and they'd all expected that they would get into the Pigott school, that we would that they found that only half of them on offer day could get into school. Whilst some of that might have been rectified by waiting for this reduction in overall allocations as children are withdrawn into the independent sector and elsewhere, certainly wouldn't have been seen as acceptable by the community. And from a local authority point of view, of course, the result of them not being able to get into the Pigott, a school they could walk to, is that they would have to be transported by coach, public bus or coach, to other schools, adding to the burdens on the already hard-pressed homeschool transport budget. So we were fortunate to be able to agree additional capacity for this year only at the Pigott school. We also had to assist us through this initial phase where we have a very high number of allocations. We had some assistance from schools who agreed to take additional offers, expecting those numbers would drop back, and as in most cases they duly did, back to their original pan. So that was the position on offer day. Moving forward from there, we opened up a number of other places, and on top of the two schools that I've mentioned, the Wangels and Embrook, we've also got additional places offered at Pigott School and to a lesser extent to the Bullmarsh School as well, all of which has helped us ensure that we've had sufficient capacity for girls. The issue has been that our expectation was that we would be able to use existing capacity in schools to be able to provide additional places into Year 7, bearing in mind that quite a number of schools have had low levels of admissions for a number of years, 2 or 3 years back, and therefore have some surplus capacity within the main body of the school. And this year that's worked reasonably successfully. It's quite clear, though, from conversations with school leaders, head teachers, etc., that actually that probably isn't going to work in future, and that we are going to have to invest in the school sector in the fairly near future to create some additional capacity. This does look very much like it's a bulge that's passing through secondary schools. We know that in some areas we have very low or relatively low levels of admissions into primary schools, and indeed there are some where we are likely to reduce their admission number. And as a consequence, when that wave of children work their way through into the secondary school sector, these children are in Key Stage 1, infants in old money, the numbers were expected to drop back. So we're expecting to see that we will need temporary accommodation, a mixture of accommodation, but some of it, certainly at least some of it, temporary accommodation, knowing that the numbers will fall back late in the 2020s. Now, when I say a bulge, I mean the high points will be about 2023, 24, but we will still see higher numbers until about, 2027/28. So it's a multi-year bulge that we're talking about, where we are talking about potentially having to provide 180 extra places next year. Plainly, if Forest's good news translates into a much higher level of allocations or preferences expressed and a higher number of allocations to the Forest, which obviously we all hope, then that number will drop back. And hopefully we might be nearer 100 extra places, shall we say. But we can't plan on that basis at this point. So that isn't pointing in itself to a need for a new school, even by the end of the decade. But we do know that in the longer term, house building is expected to continue at a fairly high rate in the borough. This is a favoured location for house builders. It's got, you all know the advantages of the area. It's highly accessible. Much of the south of the borough is countryside, but not greenbelt. It's accessible to jobs, etc. So this is an area where house builders can build and sell houses, and they are likely to be supported by national housing policy to ensure that happens, acknowledging that is a very controversial fact. So it is likely that we will wish to build into the plans for the council's plans for the future, through the local plan update process, a plan for another secondary school site. That's not to say that we're committing to open a secondary school site, but if you've got the site, you can use it, and if you haven't got the site, then you've got a lot of problems trying to find one at a later stage, if the numbers do start to rise. So we are currently working with the borough's head teachers. We've had a number of preliminary conversations with them before the summer holidays, and we're now setting up for, we've had a meeting with them collectively, which I think they found valuable in that it enabled them to share their plans and concerns with one another, so that we are moving forward in a transparent and open fashion, so that our head teachers and schools know what is likely to be happening. And we will be continuing those conversations and developing plans over the course of this, basically over the course of the autumn term, because we want to be able to make sure that we have firm agreements well before Christmas as to which schools are going to be making additional offers, and we can ensure that parents will know that as well at the point when they're confirming preferably at the point they're confirming their expressions of preferences. Those plans are likely to include the plans for the next 3 or 4 years. So this isn't simply about which schools are going to get a sort of selection of mobiles next year. It may be that there's temporary provision next year, but there may be sort of enhanced temporary provision, if you like, multi-blocks going in, or at least a coordinated plan of expansion worked out with schools aligned with their own priorities. So that's essentially where we are at the moment on the secondary in terms of provision immediately. We've got sufficient places at the moment. We have a number we are working towards provision of longer term capacity, certainly to get us over this initial bulge. We're working up the plans on the basis that this will be, if not temporary accommodation, certainly the kind of more basic accommodation that's in keeping with the council's current budget restrictions. And we've engaged with our finance colleagues in the finance team to ensure that the necessary financing is brought forward as part of the council's financial plans for the medium-term financial plan for the 2022-23 and onwards years. I would add that we do have some specific problems at the moment. On top of that, we have issues with years 8 and year 9. Again, we're hopeful that we will get capacity in individual schools. There are some challenges which schools have made plain to us, but nonetheless, we have to make that capacity. So we are hopeful that we will achieve that, we'll be successful in those negotiations in the near future. One thing you will pick up from that is that the numbers are still rising in Wokingham. Families are still moving into the borough. So there may have been a hiatus in the housing market early in 2020. Certainly by now, we are certainly been seeing over the last year is that families at both primary and secondary level are arriving in the borough, and not just into the new homes. So we're certainly seeing that this is still a borough that is attracting young families, and from a school admissions and a school planning point of view, plainly that presents challenge when you have relatively little surplus to deal with to manage that, as is the case in a number of year groups. I would just very briefly touch on a couple of other things that are going to affect us. I would just observe in terms of COVID that it certainly has caused significant disruption to our ability to deliver, but I would just wish to pay tribute to the ability of the heads over the course of the last term and through into this year, despite the extra workload that they've had, to engage positively with the discussions about additional pupils and potential expansion of their schools. There have been concerns, certainly you may have seen nationally, about the impact of Brexit on local communities. I would say from our analysis, we certainly haven't seen any signs that we have lost families from this area. Certainly we don't have any direct figures to work on, but certainly looking at first languages analysis from our school census returns, it certainly doesn't look as if there's been any significant exodus of families with children with European heritage. And in terms of the problems for the council and the wider problems for the council, it's worth highlighting that at the moment construction site costs are going up at an astronomical rate, something that's only been picked up in the statistics in the last 2 or 3 months, albeit there has been some press reporting on this for a little bit longer, and that undoubtedly is going to make life much more difficult in terms of delivering additional capacity. Not simply about money, it's also about the actual availability of resources in terms of staff and in terms of building materials. I did say I would talk very briefly about post-16. I'll just pick up on that. At the moment, there is no sign of particular stress in terms of provision. All students, to the best of our knowledge, were successful in finding places. As you may know, Wokingham students at post-16 will go to provision not just in the borough's sixth form, but to colleges in Reading, Bracknell, near Maidenhead, and in Farnborough. So we have quite a big circle in which we need to plan. We are going to be doing a further piece of development work on our post-16 strategy. A critical issue for us there is that we don't have a feel yet for quite what the impact of the UT levels could be on the likely future mix or transfer rate, particularly from the borough schools into the borough sixth forms, because these are the kind of qualifications that may be more attractive to young people who may have gone to colleges seeking vocational qualifications, and many of them can be delivered more successfully in existing sixth form accommodation without major investment. The other thing I just wish to touch on was SEN. Just to note that when we previously reported, our new secondary school is our new all through SEN school being provided by the DfE in partnership with them and with the Reading Borough Council. We've passed a number of significant milestones very recently. Not least, we've gained the planning consent for the site and for the building. Maiden Early at an earlier stage was appointed as the body to run the schools, and we have a contractor appointed. So while there may be hiccups along the way between now and opening, certainly absolutely up to date, the project has been running relatively smoothly. I don't promise that that will be the case in the future though. Okay, can I throw it open to questions, Chair?
Great, thank you very much, Piers. Questions? Pauline first.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Piers, for that very detailed initial report. I've got 3 questions. Numbers 2 and 3 are linked, so I'll deal with the first one to start with and then move to the others. It's page 19, the first paragraph. I'd like a little bit more explanation, please, about one of the phrases. It starts, as a boys' school, the Forest cannot provide places for girls. Well, that's self-evident. Then it goes on, admissions law requires these offers to be made from waiting lists in accordance with each school's oversubscription criteria. And then it says places could only be agreed at co-educational schools. I'm not quite sure why that is. If somebody's on a waiting list and they're a boy, why can't they be given a place at the Forest School?
Yep, very happy to answer this. The basic fact of the matter is schools are required by law to follow their oversubscription criteria. If you're so when we, what we did was we got to a point, the easiest point to say is that all the other schools have waiting lists. If they didn't have waiting lists, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. But because we agreed capacity extra places at schools with waiting lists, the first thing they're required to do, because they must follow their admissions arrangements, including their oversubscription criteria, is allocate from their waiting lists. So and their waiting lists, because they're co-educational schools, they include both boys and girls. So the first thing that happened is we cleared out the waiting lists. In some cases, we didn't clear out the waiting list because they're quite extensive. So you get a mixture of boys and girls allocated to those schools. Where are the boys at school? Well, some of them will be at Forest. They will be at other schools as well, but then there becomes a merry dance of pupils moving from one school to another. You know, if actually they moved to, we offered them at Pigott, and they were currently offered Wangels, then okay, that creates a capacity space at Wangels. What happens to that? Well, maybe a child at Forest moves into it. Ultimately, the movement is always from the less popular schools to the most popular schools, and that may be very quick and direct, or it may be through a chain of movements. But what we're not allowed to do is to say, well, we're going to ignore the waiting list. That would be unlawful. I would add, too, that it would be doubly unlawful, since it's almost certainly a breach of the Equalities Act, since gender is a protected characteristic. So I think you would find there was a double whammy if you tried to do that. The third issue would be, apart from any legal challenge, is the strong likelihood is that the parents who didn't get in would rock up at appeals panels and make their case very forcefully. There are any number of very well informed and very articulate parents in the Wokingham area who are perfectly capable of thinking that through for themselves and making the case very forcefully at appeals panels. So I think trying to do anything else would have backfired on us, essentially. So yeah, just to fill it in a little bit more information, at the point at which we if I've written this out somewhere, okay. So at the point at which we were just about to allocate the pupils, we found that we had 107 places that we hadn't used at Forest. We'd allocated to preferences for all other children, but we had 71, I think it was boys, and 94 girls, if I've got that right. It might be the other way around, doesn't really matter. Who we couldn't allocate to or to a preference. So we only had places at Forest, and we had this 165 children that we needed to allocate a place to, and we only had places at boys at Forest. To create sufficient capacity for them, we had to reach agreement to ensure they got an offer on offer day. We reached agreement with a number of schools, which we've done in previous years. Because they now had all had waiting lists, which wasn't the case perhaps in previous years, the initial allocations to those schools weren't our diverts, they were from their waiting list, which shuffled the children round and brought some additional children in from out of borough, because that's another thing that we're not allowed to do. You can't discriminate against children who live outside of the borough as opposed to live inside the borough. So they have to be considered strictly in terms of their ranking on the waiting list according to the oversubscription criteria. And you can't write the oversubscription criteria, so they say Wokingham residents first and then Reading residents. London Borough of Greenwich versus the governors of John Ball Primary School versus the London Borough of Greenwich, I think that judgment is. So what we then did was, so we created this additional capacity. we couldn't even allocate the 71 odd, or I think it was 71 to the 107 forest boys. We lost even further capacity at forest, effectively, or lost further allocations, created more surplus places. And whilst at one level it's a complete piece of lunacy, on the other hand, it's what the law requires you to do, and there is generally speaking, a logic behind how admissions law works. It's just in these particular circumstances, it works in a very detrimental fashion to one school in the borough. But it is reflecting parental preference. Is that reasonably clear?
Absolute minefield. My other two questions, I know putting secondary places in the right areas for where the children live is like putting a square peg into a round hole. But I hope our future strategy will not mean that children, say, who live in Arborfield are having to travel to Woodley, or children who live in Wokingham having to travel to Twyford, for example. Will that concept be built into the new strategy, that they don't have to travel away from where they live? And the second question, this year, how many children have had to travel way out of their area?
I'm afraid I don't have the figures on that at the moment, bearing in mind it's quite fluid. The offers are adjusting all the time. They adjust certainly even beyond the start of term. You will have a degree of movement. In answer to your first question, yes, of course, it's in everybody's interest that no child has to travel to school. It adds to traffic congestion, and of course, if we have to pay for it, then it adds to the burden on the general fund. And there are many, many more useful things that we can do rather than just congesting the borough with public monies. The difficulty is that not all schools are able to provide that. They have the physical ability to provide that capacity that we would like. Some of our school sites are exceedingly congested. Some of them would be very difficult to put the necessary additional features that the planners and in fact the local community would demand. The particular obvious difficulty on school sites is normally providing staff and pupil drop-off space, car parking for staff and pupil drop-off places, and that becomes a surprisingly big part of the conversation. All in all, yes, we will try where we can to increase the capacity in such a way that minimises those movements, but there are some practical limitations on some of our school sites that mean that the opportunities just won't be there. But if we can, obviously, we want to reduce the amount of cross-border movement or cross-borough movement. Yeah.
Crew.
I was only going to ask Piers about the SEND school, which he's answered, I think, saying it's got planning permission and off we go. Yes.
Andrew, please.
Yeah, we can update you. We can update as we go on the new school, but as we stand, we're all systems go.
Thanks very much, Piers, for your report. I was really interested to hear that there's going to be work done on post-16 provision that will include sort of a look at vocational qualifications, some of the changes, that are imminent there. And I'll be following that with a lot of interest. I'd like to ask a couple of questions about Forest School, but in particular, you'll see I'm interested in some of the impacts that what's happening there at the moment may be having on girls. So it is implied in the report that there are feasible measures that could ensure a higher proportion of Forest School's capacity could be filled in the future. I'm just wondering if you could, if that's correct, if I've read that correctly, if you could briefly outline what some of those measures might be. And then related to this, it is noted in the report that Forest only admitting boys is contributing to the overall places shortfall for girls. Is it possible to have any estimate of the scale of the impact on girls, both in terms of numbers, but also in what this means in practical terms? real life terms for matters such as the distance that some girls are having to travel to and from school, whether their ability to participate in after-school extracurricular and co-curricular activities might be being curtailed because, for example, of their need to use school buses.
I don't think I can fully quantify that, but I think I can agree with the line of the questioning that you're putting to me, that the effects go far beyond the kind of the simple statement that it's difficult for us to find places for girls. In that, yes, the places may well be further from home. I would observe this is a relatively small borough. And the journeys are not necessarily ones that cause a great deal of hardship, but nonetheless, the further you are away from the school that you're attending, the less likely it is that your school friends will be in your immediate community, and the more difficult it is to potentially engage in some of those after-school activities, particularly if you're reliant on school transport, which tends to leave at the end of the school day. So, yes, I'd agree with you. It's not a good position for us to be in. In terms of what could Forest do, without stating that this is a good thing or not, there are a number of single-sex schools that have gone co-educational. And in terms of purely a school organisational perspective, it would be and admissions perspective, it's much easier for you use those places because we would be able to allocate children who can't be allocated a preference school place to that school. So had it been the case that the school had been co-educational with the numbers that we've got, assuming those parents hadn't been able to get places at schools outside of the borough, we would have used the places or a much higher proportion at the Forest. I think other than that, the questions really are things that are really not necessarily directly, if the school was to remain as a single-sex school, I think the fact that they have moved their Ofsted rating has changed. They now have a good Ofsted rating right through the school. That is something that Wokingham parents will see and will respect. But what I don't know is how many of them will think that that is sufficient in its own right to tip the balance in terms of expressing a high preference, first or second preference for the Forest school. It is generally the case that single-sex education for girls is easier to sell than single-sex education for boys. Certainly that's been the case wherever else I've worked. But there are a number of examples of very successful, very popular single-sex boys' schools. So we hope if the Forest continues as a single-sex school, that it is now moving on that path to be a successful and popular school. We might, as for other things, we don't hold money to invest in the school site, but maybe we should be looking at working with the school governors to see if there is anything we can do to promote investment into the school from the DFE's coffers. As an academy, we every time a school converts to academy status, the amount of money that we get for school maintenance drops down, and proportionately the central budget for maintenance of schools increases, the budget that's used to fund academies. So whilst it's difficult to see how we would invest, certainly we might be looking to work with the school to see if there's anything we can do to help them encourage the people who do have the cash to invest. But there's no magic wand, fortunately.
Thanks very much, Piers, for the answer to that question about Forest School. I'm just wondering, Chair, if it's okay for me to ask whether there are any other officers present who might want to say anything about the impacts that the shortfall in places for girls might be having on their real life experience, as it were, whether this is something which is on the radar, whether it's something that is deserving of further exploration.
There's only Piers and I left on the call from an office perspective, because I allowed our children's social care officers not to join this evening. So we can take away your question, Andrew. I mean, I think it's you know, we are obviously considering that there's additional pressures for girls, but it's not something that I can just give you a kind of quick response to in this meeting. I think we just need to, if you could, again, as I asked Prue, if you could put your question in writing to me, I'm happy to share it back with the committee, but I think it's one that's worth us just taking away and thinking about and giving a proper response to.
Absolutely, thank you very much. I do have one other question for Piers, if that's okay. I think the modelling outlined in the report is very clear and comprehensive, although it's incredibly complicated. And many thanks to everybody who's been involved, you know, with this. Is there anything that officers feel, that Piers, you feel could be done differently, or that any of your colleagues have suggested might be done differently or better to improve this further? For example, do you feel that communications on matters relating to new housing numbers are always being forwarded in a timely manner? Are there ways that communications with existing schools might be improved? And I guess this question is also partly linked to the idea, the principle of trying to follow and learn from best practice, for example, lessons from other boroughs and so forth, and also you know, maintaining a culture of continuous improvement. So are there things which you would like to be able to do differently, better, and so forth?
I suppose that with retrospect, which is always the easiest way to see things, I would say that I hadn't taken sufficient account of the problems or the wider impact of the issue of popularity and a single-sex school. And I think that's something that you know, certainly hasn't affected us previously. It's been obvious that it's been less popular, but we haven't had this kind of direct trade-off where we've creating additional capacity has had this direct link into the school, you know, into creating a even bigger problem for the school concerned. So I think that's certainly something. I think in terms about partnership, you can always do better. That's a simple matter of fact. I think certainly we found that secondary, we had a very useful meeting, that said, with the Secondary Federation on earlier this week, and I think the question would be actually what would we do to kind of generate that kind of sharing of information so that heads can feel confident that they're making decisions with us about offering additional places without undermining their colleagues. They certainly have a considerable interest in ensuring that they're not undermining the integrity, as it were, of education across the borough, and that's certainly something that I need to reflect on, I think. In terms of place numbers, well, I sit amongst the team that does the borough's place planning and is writing the local plan update and is responsible for the analysis of the 5-year housing land supply figures. I think I would be shot if I said that there was any deficiencies in the information that they provided me. It is a matter of fact that certainly in terms of the near future, we don't know where the housing will go, and of course we can't be confident about what the numbers will be, because once the developers have got consent, it's in their hands as to how rapidly they will build housing out. At the moment, they've been quite proficient in turning out large numbers of houses, but we know that the housing industry has historically always been cyclical. So there's no reason to think that high rate of production will necessarily continue indefinitely into the future. It hasn't in the past. In terms of where the new housing will go, I think we can all be reasonably confident it'll be somewhere not that far from the land from Wokingham town through to Shinfield, simply because we know we can't go beyond Shinfield, which is what we were all planning for up until not that many months ago, until the Department for Defence, they changed their risk assessment and decided that actually the Graiseley area wasn't a suitable place for housing. So, that's an example of how our plans are flexible and do have to change. And at the moment, there are a number of sites in consideration, but they're not formally adopted at the moment. And working with the team, I understand that process, I think, reasonably well. So what comes out of that process will determine, to a large extent, the geography of the population of the borough over the next 10 to 20 years. And it's far, far from fixed at the moment. I suppose, in terms of projection methodology, I think you can always look at it. I suppose my reflection is, I think it's always likely that projections are never right. They will, and what that tells me is that you need to be flexible and keep them under review. So, the example of this housing site that we were talking about, I think is just an example of a reflection about building flexibility into the plans, because the projections at the moment aren't indicating that we're going to need a new secondary school. But I'm not telling you that the second projections in 3 or 4 years' time will necessarily tell you the same thing. We'll do a strategy that's got a 10-year life on it, but towards the end of the 10 years, it's as much about building opportunity to deal with whatever changes come our way, rather than saying exactly in 10 years' time, we will do X. I'm not sure if that helps very much. I hope it does a bit.
It helps a lot. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Thank you, Piers. From your report, there's obviously quite a lot of challenges ahead, and the bulge that you talk about is not really that far away, is it? We're looking at 22, 23 initially.
I mean, the effect is with us, yes.
Yeah, no, and you're obviously talking as well about quite a lot of challenges, as in providing temporary accommodation and obviously preparation for the schools that would, 22 is next year. Preparation will head teachers will need to be undertaking kind of start of this academic year for next year. So how confident do you feel, what kind of place are we at to be able to really say that we're going to be able to manage this in 22, 23, these extra places?
I think the head teachers have a very clear view of the challenges. None of them have suggested that there are insurmountable obstacles. I think they have given us a clear and honest account of the challenges that they have, though, in terms of providing additional places. But the initial conversations with us have pointed to a number of potential openings, provided that particularly important, I think, is that the aspirations of schools, because this is essentially what we're looking to do, it is a matter of necessity for their partnership, is that our proposals have to dovetail with their own plans for the development of their sites and their schools. But there are a number of institutions that do have some clear ideas about where they would like to go next. I think the issue for us is that we need to focus rather on the very high quality buildings that we've built in the recent past, and look at a kind of simpler, modular, more off the shelf type of design, which a number of schools have used themselves. The type of system that the Pigott School and the Forest School have used to provide sixth form accommodation and new blocks, working with constrained school funds. So I don't think any of that is insurmountable, but it's undoubtedly challenging, and there are undoubtedly risks there. So at the moment, we're having some fairly broad range discussions with schools. Some of them are masters of their own destiny, as it were, locally, so we can talk to the people, the decision makers, fairly readily. Some of them are parts of academy chains. And they need to refer to, ultimately, their central trusts, which may not be local. So, yes, I think it's doable. Yes, you're right to sound a note of caution. I would echo that.
Thank you.
Just in terms of the temporary accommodation piers, I mean, clearly the schools would need to accommodate that, but I just wonder also, since the bulge is going to move, it seems, from one area to another, whether we're going to be able to put it in one place, but when the demand changes, to move to another place, whether that's in the school's interest to do that. Would that work?
It's more likely that we would leave the schools to make use of that accommodation. So that's got to be, I think, part of the thinking for the schools is, you know, this will take us, this bulge will work its way through the school. What can we do with this in future that adds, you know, longer term benefit to the school, even if it's, you know, just additional accommodation. Actually, a high proportion of the cost is sunk into things that you don't get back from picking it up and moving it. You know, even with mobile classrooms. Gosh, I always quote the example of Lambs Lane, where we put 2 mobile classrooms in, and it cost us something north of £100,000, as I recall it, best part of a decade ago. And we already owned the 2 mobile classrooms that we put in. Because so much of the cost goes into groundworks, which of course you can't move, and into ancillary works. In Lambs Lane, it was creating a new car park, and you know, those kind of costs are actually where an awful lot of your spend will go, because they're kind of fixed, even if whatever the standard of accommodation that you're using. But yes, I mean, ultimately, it's potential that we will decide that we would still, despite that, be best decide on to move the schools, to move the class, to move those blocks. That is a possibility, but that really depends on the host school having decided that there isn't a use for it.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions for peers on this report? Prue?
Not a question on this report, but there doesn't seem to be another place to say this, that the new Education Secretary is Nadeem Zahawi, who I don't think is noted for his expertise in education, but never mind.
There's a non-political point for you. Okay, thank you very much, Piers. That was a very useful report. Thank you for taking us through that and answering all those questions. And we wish you luck, because it's clearly a very important issue for our residents. It's one that as councillors, we get comments on all the time, and people having to locate to schools that are further away from home is never a great thing, and realise it's a very complicated puzzle. But good luck with that. You have our best wishes for sorting it out. Thank you. So we'll move on to the forward plan, which is item 20, pages 33 to 36. Just to run through that again and see if we're still happy. Sorry, Prue, you had to get the hand up.
I don't know how you're going to do this. So there is an extra item that I'd like to put in November's, if we can.
Let's hear your suggestion then.
We've had a new homeschool transport policy, and I think it might be good to review its implementation, because there's been a few bumps at the beginning of term, and they hopefully will be all sorted by then. So to have a review of how it went, the policy itself, but also the implementation of it.
Okay, Carol, do you know if the timescale would be suitable to take that to the November meeting? Will it be sorted by then?
Yes, it's not the homeschool transport policy, because that's not implemented until 2022. It's a new measure that was taken in our corporate transport unit to put in a new system that's caused the bumps, which I'm quite happy to come back with, because we're doing a quick kind of review of that and lessons learned. So I'm happy to bring that to the November meeting if members will think that would be useful. But it's not actually the policy.
No, sorry, I forgot the policy's a year lag. Yes, you're right. No, the policy, as far as I'm concerned, is the fine bit anyway. It's the other bit that hasn't quite worked.
But I'm more than happy to bring the kind of what we've done as a kind of a piece of work we've done following this year's homeschool transport process, and to reassure members how we will work moving forward. And happy to take scrutiny on that because we would welcome views. So we can do that in November, Chair. That's not a problem.
Okay, thank you. Everyone happy to add that to the members' agenda? Okay. So anything else on the November meeting? Turning over then to January meeting. Anyone content? And then the March meeting. True.
There is nothing on here now for this section we used to have about schools causing concern. Are we not going to be doing that anymore in the future? We normally used to have that as a kind of standing item.
My understanding was that because schools were not going through the Ofsted regime because of the pandemic, Gillian asked to remove that from the forward plan. Now I can have a conversation with her to see that if she can bring it back. Carol, I don't know if you had a conversation with Gillian about it.
That's fine, Lucianne. If you pick it up with Gillian, you're right. It was taken off because we didn't have anything to report on, but we were able to reschedule that now in a way that is useful for the committee.
Okay, so Lucianne will take the action on that. Come back. I just know. Anything else as far as the forward programme is concerned? No. Okay. So I think that's it. I think the one thing that Carol was going to mention, she already did at the start of the meeting, about the success of our application. So I have no other items of business. So I will bring the meeting to a close. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.